Well, here we are in week 3 of our teaching series, In This Together. When we began thinking of this series to pursue unity together, there was at least one other person I wanted our whole church to hear from, Kevin Odor. In fact, a conversation with him helped lay the groundwork for this whole series. For those of you who don't know, Kevin helped start Canyon Ridge over 28 years ago and served as our senior pastor here for 23 plus years, before retiring just over a year ago. After a year of rest, he graciously accepted the invitation to teach us this weekend. His heart has always been and still is, I'm here to help. Kevin has a heart for unity and for the people of Las Vegas. I always learn something from KO, and I know you will too. Let's welcome Kevin Odor.
Well, it is good to be back, and I'm honored to have the invitation to talk to you this weekend. And what a season of life we are all in. I mean, wow, this COVID-19 thing, so much loss. I mean, not just the loss of life, 131,000 so far and counting. The loss of jobs, the economic impact has been so enormous, the loss of major life events that have been canceled and postponed, and graduations and weddings, and the huge relational impact and loss when loved ones are ill. You can't visit them in the hospital or in the nursing home. When loved ones pass away, you can't even have a service. The gathering for Easter this year was canceled. Easter was canceled. I know it wasn't. We met together online, but still it was like, that's something I never saw coming. Vacations have been canceled. Trips that were booked weeks and months in advance were canceled. And then as we started to open up and had some hope and maybe something's there that we can get back to, eventually it began, then that led to more division because you're opening up too slow or you're opening up too fast. You're too safe or you're not safe enough. And then masks became politicized, and if you wore one or didn't wear one, do you open up church? Do you gather? Not yet, but people are still at risk. Well, in the middle of that, Pastor Drew asked me back for the interview, welcomed me back after the year away. And I mentioned in that interview my concern about division or the potential for conflict and division over COVID-19. And since then, I've stumbled on the term, this is free, you can use it, COVID careful or COVID casual. Because as people talked about COVID and the two extremes of how people respond, sometimes it's divisive language and accusatory language and judgmental language, and COVID careful and COVID casual kind of help us word who we are and who our loved ones are and how we honor each other as we go through this crisis. Families are divided over COVID. They are. Some have a COVID bubble. Some are totally open. Some parents and kids are on different pages, and grandkids and siblings, and businesses are divided about COVID. Some are essential and continuing to work, and some are not, and there's a loss of jobs, and employees that are working are at risk. There's division there. Churches are divided about COVID because do you meet because we have the right, or do you wait till we're safe and the vulnerable aren't at risk? And that leads to division and conflict and loss and anxiety and grief. And the grief is what I hear, the shock and denial and guilt and anger and depression and acceptance, and the anger that we feel is the frustration anger. And so I'm listening to that, and I'm hearing it. And in the middle of this whole COVID frustration comes May 25th, when George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, during an arrest for allegedly using a counterfeit bill. A white police officer knelt on Floyd's neck for almost 8 minutes while Floyd was handcuffed and lying face down, begging for his life and repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe." And that was a spark that ignited unhealed racial wounds in our nation from our past history. And it added to division and conflict and loss and anxiety and grief. The nation seemed to erupt. Peaceful protests that had looting and rioting and destruction based on anger. Police officers who were to keep the peace and had been praised as first responders then became targets of violence themselves. We were divided racially, divided politically, grieving over COVID, and then the COVID seems to be coming back, and now what do we do and what do we feel? You ever seen anything like this? And people have asked me, Kevin, you ever seen anything like this in my lifetime? And not exactly, but there's some similarities to a season I do remember. April 4th, 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King. The Chicago riots that erupted for 3 days afterwards. I was 11, and I remember that. And June 5th, 1968, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, U.S. Senator, brother of JFK, and there was, again, turmoil in our nation. And then August of 1968, fueled by the Vietnam protest, 8 days of riots in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. Because Vietnam was a divisive issue in our nation. And the assassination shocked us to our core. It was a tough time. A year later, our cultural revolution was in full swing. August of '69, Woodstock. You know, the countercultural expression, anti-war, drugs, sex, rock and roll. And then in 1970, the Kent State shootings. Kent State in Kent, Ohio. 28 National Guard soldiers fired approximately 67 rounds over a period of 13 seconds, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. Our nation was deeply divided. I remember that. Added to my perspective, my life perspective, is just other points of view, and one is from Scripture. And the Bible does speak about racism and racial division. I mean, the Old Testament story has at the core of it when Israel was in slavery in Egypt. The Hebrew nations were slaves to the Egyptians, and the Jewish people were praying for a Savior, and Moses came and led them to the Promised Land. And the Passover, all that's part of the heritage, our heritage. And then the New Testament talks about the Jews and the Gentile division, a racial division that came to a head in Acts chapter 15 that almost split the first century church. So the Bible speaks of the challenges of racism, and in its very story. As a student of world history, racism has reared its ugly head so many times, and just looking at World War II and Hitler and his desire for an Aryan nation and making Jews wear gold stars and singling them out and terminating 6 million execution. The anti-Semitism of that time is so extreme. Surely we're done with that, aren't we? But do you remember in 2018 in Pittsburgh that a synagogue was shot up? In 2019 in San Diego, another synagogue was shot up. I remember also here at the Ridge, closer to home, during the Promise Keeper emphasis on us trying to fight racism in America, that we gathered as men to talk about it together, and we had a Hispanic brother stand up and tell his story about how he encountered racism when he went home to the parents of his white girlfriend to ask for her hand in marriage. They ended up getting married, but the story is still a wound in his soul. We heard from another brother who talked about when he was a child that he was rounded up and put in a Japanese internment camp in California during World War II, and the names that he was called as a Japanese American. Italian Americans, and then stood up and talked about the names they were called as Italian Americans. And then the African American brothers stood up and shared their story. We have a long history with African Americans in America. Before America was a nation, the European founders of our country utilized the slave trade in the Americas for economic gain. And the founders of our country, when it came time to break away from England and to have independence, knew that they needed all 13 colonies, so they put on the back burner the issue of slavery. We'll deal with that another day, and a day of reckoning came, and it was Abraham Lincoln who said, the time has come. And the Civil War erupted, and the Emancipation Proclamation was declared, and the war was amazing. It was so devastating to our nation. 618,222 Americans died to end slavery. The northern states called the war, there was a war to preserve the Union and end slavery. The southern states called it all about states' rights, not about slavery at all. In 1860, in that Civil War of 618,000 people dying. I was just curious, how does that relate to our other wars that our nation has been in? In the Revolutionary War, 25,000 Americans died. World War I, 116,000 Americans died. World War II, 405,000 Americans died. Korean War, 36,000 Americans. Vietnam War, 58,000 Americans. In Iraq, 4,500 Americans. In the Civil War, 618,222. This July 4th weekend, we're celebrating freedom. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was the aspiration back in 1776. On July 1st, 1863, the nation approached the third year of the bloody Civil War, and the Emancipation Proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. The 14th and 15th Amendments were added to our Constitution. Bill of Rights Act, full rights as full citizens for everyone. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was needed to finally ensure that every African American could vote. In 1920, just as a context, the women's suffrage movement finally secured the women's right to vote just 100 years ago. August 28, 1963, in the 60s, there was a march on Washington. And Martin Luther King gave a speech that day that we all know about. And we may know the speech and remember it. He said words like this: I say to you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This is our hope. And with this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my father died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. That was 1963. How are we doing? In 2020, we're not there yet. We're still aspiring to something better, still struggling to make the ideals of our founding and of our great leaders of the past a reality in our present. I mean, our nation's seal has the phrase in it, e pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. Man, is that hard. And that's the sad truth. It's been our goal, our dream, to be a united nation, the United States. But division is way too easy. Fighting is way too easy. Hating is the easy road, the low road. But the high road is loving and forgiving and building bridges and coming together. See, unity is hard. Unity is challenging. Unity is frustrating, and it's seemingly impossible. Our founders aspired to it. MLK dreamed of it. Jesus prayed for it. In John chapter 17, Drew spoke on it a couple weeks ago. The dream of unity for all of us. And Jesus can be our one source, which he talked about John 15 last week. So this weekend, I thought we'd stay in John and look at John chapter 8, which will help us with some ideas of how do we get there. And the title of this weekend is We Fight for It. We fight for unity. It's a weird phrase, but I want you to remember it. How do we fight for unity? Well, Jesus tells us, there's a great story about Jesus we're going to read through. And as we do, we're going to see some ways that the heart of Jesus can help us as we move forward to fight for unity. Let's start reading the first few verses. Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? Drama. Real life drama, and it was a tough deal. I mean, here's everyone looking at Jesus and looking at the woman saying, what do we do here? And one of the details of this story, just so you know, is usually when adultery happens, it's two people, and there was only one in front of Jesus. Something wasn't just, something wasn't fair, double standard, hypocrisy, not equal application of the law right there in front of us. Another detail of the story is that the woman was known. Everyone knew her sin. That's one of our greatest fears, isn't it? That everybody knows what we've done wrong. When we say, no one will ever know, I'll be able to hide it. When everyone knows, and there's this woman, everyone knew. The first fight for unity that I want us to see is when we fight with myself. The fight with myself in my own heart is I'm a sinner saved by grace. That's the truth. I've known right and chosen wrong. I'm a sinner saved by grace. The grace of God forgives me. So that's my first fight, is to remember that as I encounter other people that are conflict with me or in conflict with me. Quarantine's been good for my wife and I. We've found several things that we enjoy that we're going to keep. But one day we got a little sideways, and it was because we had a conversation with one of our family members, and in the course of that conversation, I threw my wife under the bus. Terrible phrase, but you know what I mean when I made her look bad and made me look good. We didn't have time to clean it up right then. Later, when we revisited the incident, and this is how her approach was, very wise lady. She goes, as I was running an errand, she goes, while you're driving, I want you to think about why you said what you said, the way you said it. And we'll talk about it when you get back. And of course, as I started driving, I thought, well, what I said was right. I'm justified because, and it was a very defensive posture. She just didn't understand why I said what I said. That's all I have to do is explain it to her. But then, the more I thought of why I said what I said. Was there something deep and flawed and broken in me that led to me throwing my wife under the bus, making her look bad and making me look good? See, that battle was a battle within me. It was when I had to fight with myself. I had to look at the reality. What if we all did that in all of these divisions that we're facing? Why is there division, conflict, and hurt? Sin. It's a challenging word because we're all flawed. It's easier to say that there's a good side to us, but there's a flawed side to us as well. And I am a sinner saved by grace. I got to remember that. And when I'm standing there with a stone in my hand, maybe I need to remember that I am a sinner saved by grace as well. Back to the story. This woman was caught in adultery. And what are you going to say? What do you say, Jesus? And this is what they were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. And then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. Jesus is so smart. So wise, so appropriate, because he knew there was a question behind the question. And just as a detail of the story, as we look at it, I'm always wondering what he wrote in the sand. Wouldn't it be fascinating to know that? But here we're knowing that the detail behind the question is Jesus wanted us to know that we're all flawed. All of us are flawed. And if that's the case, if I'm a sinner saved by grace and I'm looking at somebody who's flawed, why would I fight with them? Because they are fellow sinners offering God's amazing grace too. Who am I fighting with? One of God's kids, one of God's children that he made on purpose, and they're fellow sinners that can accept God's grace as well. Why would I fight with them? About 4 years ago, our men's group I was in, we're gathering for a 4 o'clock meeting. I had an agenda, I was ready to teach, but the casual conversation before we got started was about the news, and the news in Charlotte, North Carolina specifically, where there's some riots going on. And why were there riots then? Because Keith Lamont Scott, a 43-year-old African-American man, was fatally shot on September 20th of 2016 in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Brantley Vincent, an African-American city police officer, was the one that shot him. It sparked peaceful protests that led to violent riots. And one of our guys had family in Charlottesville, and so somebody said, well, are they safe? Yeah, they're fine. And then I sensed this nudge. We need to talk about this. So we put aside the agenda and we talked. Fellows, we love each other. We know each other. We've been together for a while. 3 of our group are African Americans. 5 of us are white. Tell us white guys what we need to know. When we look at the news and we don't understand the anger and the violence. And slowly they started to open up their lives and tell us a chapter of their story where they had been pulled over by police because they were driving in the wrong neighborhood to have a nice car like that. Where they were driving in another neighborhood because their parents had received education and moved to a nicer place to raise their kids, they thought. And they were just stopped because of the color of their skin. Where one of the guys had an interracial marriage, and he said that his wife worries when he goes out at night by himself if he's going to come back home. And us white guys go, our wives never worry about that. It was a deep, sacred conversation. We heard something. We learned something. And we sensed the anger. And we didn't understand it fully, but we started to. Now, the Bible says clearly in Ephesians 4:26, in your anger, do not sin. And it's not good to hurt people with your anger. It's not good to hurt property with your anger. There's all kinds of reasons not to do that. That isn't just helpful. But the hurt was something that we heard. And God has a righteous anger when his children are violated, and he's created the government to administer justice, and when the government works right, it does. But here, among brothers, we talked about our personal relationships and racism with respect. We talked. Can we do that? What about them? Do I fight with them? They're a fellow sinner. Offer God's grace as well. Back to the story. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. Powerful moment. Fighting for them is our next fight. We fight with ourselves. We fight with them. Why? We fight for them. That's what it means to fight for a relationship. That you overcome the obstacles to get there. And for that to occur, guess what's very helpful is if you have an empty hand. If you're standing there with a rock in your hand, it's hard to fight for them, to build a bridge to them. But when you drop the rock, you can reach out. One of the discouraging things of division that I've seen throughout my life is the division within the church. Church is divided. Even though Jesus prayed for unity in John 17, the church has been divided. The Catholic Church, split into Eastern Orthodox Catholicism and Roman Catholicism. And then the Reformation came that led to Lutherans and Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Reformed, Methodists, Baptists, Congregationals, Pentecostals, Assembly of God, Seventh-day, Calvary Chapel, non-denominationals, literally several hundred denominations. And all Jesus said, God, will they just be one? I've always loved at the Ridge that we've fought for unity. People from different church backgrounds and no church backgrounds being one. Simple followers of Jesus together. How can we go about that? With this phrase, in essentials, unity. In opinions, liberty. In all things, love. There are certain things that we definitely are one with. And we give each other the grace to have opinions, the liberty to, that's your opinion, this is my opinion, but we're still connected in all things we love. If we can live out that creed, denominations can come together and be simple New Testament Christians together, and that's what we've done. But guess what? That formula works for all of us, no matter what the division is, how we can hang together. See in this story that Jesus is involved with this woman. I'm a sinner saved by grace. You're a sinner offered grace. That's an essential. You have your reasons to believe what you believe. I have my reasons. Let's talk. Is the opinions being shared? And we can agree disagreeably and we'll love each other. Wow, that's a great formula. How do we live in unity? How do we fight for unity? It's this kind of principles that drive us forward. And one of the things that the Apostle Paul gave us in the book of Romans is the idea of God's grace, which was a tremendous book. He needed grace so much in his own life, and he explains how we all get it. And once he explained that you get grace, God loves you and accepts you and forgives you and adopts you and gifts you, how do we live now that we have that? In Romans chapter 12, he goes on a riff of how we're supposed to live. Since we've received this grace, since we are sinners saved by grace through faith, this is how we're supposed to live. I'm going to read through this, kind of pausing slowly, allowing the words to perhaps be a mirror for you. It says, am I holding something in my hand? Is there something I need to drop? Is there a way I need to change how I live? It says in Romans 12, don't just pretend to love others, really love them. Hate what is wrong. Hold tightly to what is good. Love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other, even on social media. Bless those who persecute you. Oh, don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. When you know that you're growing when you can pray for your enemy. That's a challenge. Be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. Do you feel the pain of those who are hurt by racism? Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people. Are you just going to hang with your own, or are you going to build a bridge to those that are different? And don't think you will know it, you know it all. Do you already know it all, or are you still teachable? Never pay back evil with more evil. Well, that's tough. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live at peace with everyone. All the tennis balls are on the other side of the net because you've initiated and you've responded and you haven't gone cold. Dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that for the righteous anger of God, for the scriptures say, I will take revenge, I will pay them back, says the Lord. See, God is a God of justice, and he wants justice to be done, but he asks us to forgive personally as he takes care of justice through the government. Instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals of shame on their head. The phrase is, kill them with kindness. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. That's what we're called for. Do we stand here with a rock in our hand, or have we dropped it? And is it open? Are we willing to love others? Be happy with those who are happy. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony. Don't be proud. Don't think you know it all. Man, those are tough phrases. Can we really live that out? Personally, we forgive. The government does justice. I'm challenging all of us to fight for unity. You know, it's not going to happen just like that. It's something we have to lean into, and it's something that we have a responsibility to do. And if anybody's going to do it in our culture right now, who's it going to be? And just maybe it's us. And that's what God calls us to this weekend. In a moment, we're going to reflect. And a moment gives a time of reflection. You can take communion. And the team is going to sing a great song that is really from the perspective of the woman caught in adultery, which is all of our perspectives if we're sinners saved by grace. And as we take communion, it's really Jesus saying, I fought for you. And we realize he did. And when our hands are empty, we realize now we can reach out and fight for unity. That's our prayer this weekend, on this holiday weekend, that we accept that challenge and make unity real. Let's think on that together.